Right, we're going to kick off as Scott said, I'm from IRESS. IRESS is a global company. We've been in the UK since 2011 now, although the different products that we have in the UK we've acquired and acquired into the business have been there far, far longer. So we own the products from old Avello, which is Advisor Office, Office Web, the Exchange, Trigold, etc. as well. So our heritage in the UK is strong, but obviously our head office is in Australia, and we've actually done quite a lot of toing and froing using various technology collaboration to pick up some of the stories for today as well. And so hopefully we'll be able to give you the inside story about how the financial market's been developing over in Australia. Not just in Australia, we're also in South Africa, Singapore, Hong Kong, Canada, and we can always touch on some of those as we go through if necessary. I think more of that will be picked up by Phil. I'll focus very much on Australia. I'm not going to be talking about IRESS more than that today. If you do have any questions, ask myself or Luke here at the front, and we can in the breaks, and we can update you on that at that point. Enough about us though. I'd like to know a little bit about the audience as well, so we can make sure we pitch this right. How many people here are practicing advisors themselves? Okay, probably the largest. How many are from an administration background? No? Paraplanners? Suppliers to the market? Okay, cool. Okay, it just gives me a little bit of a feeling as I go through. Right, what we're going to focus on is we're going to talk a lot about FOFA. We're going to contrast that to RDR, where often actually the similarities, it's not just about contrasting, it's actually looking at how things are quite similar in many instances. We'll look about what effect that's had on the Australian market, whether there's any lessons that we can learn here at the UK as we go into the reviewing the changes to RDR as well in the UK. We'll look at the underpinning role of technology in helping the advice market reach and meet some of the challenges that are presented by FOFA over in Australia, and we'll draw out some of the key learning points. But I think the first thing to start with is that we are two countries that are very similar in very many ways, but equally we're quite different in many ways as well. The cultural changes we see between the two different sides of the organisation in Australia and the UK are quite substantial. It's sometimes maybe something as trivial as the weather that's different, but the way that people work is actually very different. I think you know, the way people write emails, people often take offence at the abruptness of some of the Australian mannerisms, but often it is quite superficial on some of the differences. Even the war between Vegemite and Marmite that exists in our office, because we've got a lot of Australians in our Warwick office, and we have to supply both Marmite and Vegemite in the kitchen so that everybody can be kept happy. The differences may seem small, but they are very active. Now, of course, sporting one is one that we often have issues over in the office. The World Cup was hell. Imagine we've got South Africa, Australia, New Zealand people in our office, and then us Brits and anyone from the Northern Hemisphere rather struggling. I'm a bit upset with our marketing department that the World Cup winners that they could find from Australia from this year, we had to go back 12 years to find some triumph over the Aussies in a World Cup scenario. And being a Welshman, that's probably almost as painful for me as it is for the Australians to see Johnny kicking that goal. And of course we come to Christmas time, and the reason why I put this up is I think when we come through and look at some of the things that are different between Australia and the UK, it's often a matter of timing. It's actually some of the things are just happening at a different pace. So if we come back to FOFA, well, RDR to start with was what, January 2013. Around 6 months on to Australia's winter, and that's when FOFA became officially mandatory as well. So often things aren't that different, they just happen at different times of the year, and we'll touch on that as we go through. So let's look at RDR. RDR as a backdrop, I'm sure a lot of you know a lot about this subject, but what was nice about RDR is at least we had some clear sets of goals of what it was trying to achieve. And the overriding thing, I guess, was this was about trying to get a proper functioning marketplace for financial advice. And we can break that down to the 4 areas. Professionalism around the qualifications around CPD, transparency around the definitions of independence, around the pricing, around the proposition that was there, of course, removal of bias with the commission ban, and of course, access with the simplified advice. And if we look at how we think that we scored there, I think we probably got a mixed report card. If we look at the professionalism, largely I think it's probably exceeded expectations. And I think as you look around the marketplace, people now aspire to get those qualifications, and not just advisors. I think people outside of the market looking to come in actually quite like the idea that they're going to have those qualifications against their name. I see people that are in adjacent industries, people in technology companies servicing the marketplace that want to take those exams as well. Again, removal of bias, I think we've got some good progress there. Transparency, maybe I'm debating whether that should be orange rather than green. I think certainly we've done a certain amount to get there, but I think some of the definitions maybe aren't quite as clear as they could be, and certainly some of the documentation and you know, suitability letters that we're producing certainly could do with a little bit more accessibility within them. And I guess the one that on the scorecard we've marked harshest is access. And it says here we've gone backwards. I'm not sure completely that we've gone backwards in terms of true advice. I think the number of financial advisors went down slightly but is recovering, so I don't think that is so much the issue. I think it's the access to financial products from a wider perspective. You know, if people value advice and are prepared to pay for advice, I think there is enough people out there to get some of that advice. It's those people that we're trying to get to beyond that. There's definitely an underserved market that we need to work out that won't pay for that financial advice, that we need to work out how we access. Now, before I contrast that with FOFA, it's worth just drawing out some of the other differences between Australia financial planning market and the UK. I think the biggest single one is the record of auto contributions. So superannuation in Australia has been around, I think, for about 20 odd years. It's been much more entwined in the whole industry. The current rates are 9.5%, that's rising. We're 2% currently in the UK, again rising, but never to the levels that the Australians are at. And what that's meant is we've got bigger pockets of finance to actually manage there. There's also very complex regimes around the taxation on those pots as well. What that's led to is a real rise in the number of financial advisors in the marketplace over there as they guide the general population through that. So we actually have a world here that we have, in Australia, about 20,000 advisors serving 23 million people. If we contrast that in the UK, not quite 3 times the population, but we've got 28,000 advisors if we include the banks and would go beyond the IFA market. Really far less people servicing the market than we have in Australia. The other thing that's happened, I think, is those advisors have grouped into larger entities in Australia. So we have a lot of vertical integration, the banks and product providers owning large dealer groups, which is equivalent of our networks, and other national firms, and the people are really grouping into those far more. Now we're seeing consolidation in the UK. IRESS works with people like Towery, Succession, AHF, and AFH, and a lot of those big firms, but it's at a slower pace here than it is over in Australia that's already consolidated around that. Couple of other areas worth mentioning. Because of those larger firms and that vertical integration, there tends to be more point-to-point integration, certainly in technology terms, with the product providers and the manufacturers and the distributors of financial services. And what that means is that people have tended to try and re-engineer the whole financial advice process from start to finish, rather than just focusing on individual components and then trying to stick them together. I think the other thing that's worth saying is, while we often think that RDR got a lot of attention in the Houses of Parliament and with various politicians, I think we ain't seen anything over here really compared to how political it got over in Australia, where it became a real battleground in terms of politics. So there's a whole host of political motivations swirling around the FOFA regulations as well. So let's look at FOFA. Again, same overriding goal, trying to get a properly functioning marketplace. But they didn't really tackle professionalism, certainly not in terms of the qualifications that you need to get. They did look at banning any conflicted payments, as they call it, to remove bias. The transparency went really quite aggressive. So there was enshrined in the law the best interests of the client. They had to send out a statement of fees on an annual basis, which said what fees they would charge for and what they had promised, what they were entitled to for those fees and what they'd actually got for those fees. And that had to go out annually. And then originally, there was also a 2-year opt-in that went in there as well. And that was where the advisors had to write to their clients every 2 years and say, this is what we're charging you next year. Are you happy for us to charge you again on that basis? And they had to, and the clients had to proactively opt into the services for the next year, which obviously sent fear through the marketplace and caused all sorts of issues. They tried to address the access issue as well. They've called that scaled advice. That's really what, in the old money, I would have called focused advice. So it's taking an individual need and following a series of safe harbor steps to stay within that need, so that we can, so that you can actually do product, you can sell, I guess, more streamlined, not having to go into the wholesale advice. How have they done on that? I haven't marked professionalism as red, sorry, it's gone as orange, because even though it wasn't the aim of the legislation, there's a lot of people that would say professionalism and the perception of professionalism of the Australian financial planning market has improved. And the reason for that is some of these other things, like the transparency and removal of bias, took it away from a sales culture, and to be fair, it was already quite the way down a servicing culture, but really took it to that servicing and advice culture that it needed to be. And that, by default, has raised the standards of professionalism. I think the other thing is so many things changed in terms of things like the best advice and the transparency issues, that there was a lot of refresher training that went on with the advisors in the marketplace in any case. So on average in 2013, everyone went through, they were all going through 20 days of external training. So I think quite a lot of work went on in that space in any case. Removal of bias, good progress. Transparency was decided it went too far. So they actually unwound some of that legislation. Importantly, the opt-in requirement was removed. I think just too many people were scared off by that. There was huge political lobby, and change of government enabled things to change, and we lost the opt-in part of the legislation, much to the relief of many people. The access, again, so similar to the UK, the access they really struggled with. There have been few people trying to make scaled advice work, but they tend to be the larger organizations. So scaled advice, if you look at the banks, they're heavily investing in that and driving stuff down the scaled advice route. The smaller firms, even the mid-sized firms, are struggling to price their offerings in the scaled advice arena. They're struggling for consumers to see the value when they don't go for the holistic financial planning. And I've always believed that in the UK. In any case, the more holistic your planning services, the higher up the value chain you get to cash flow planning, lifestyle planning, you get less price sensitivity within the service. When you're down at a scaled advice, you're really talking about getting nearer to the flogging and product routine. It's far more price sensitive, and the scales that you need to do that has ruled a lot of people out of the firm. Out of the market, out of doing that those services. So we still have issues around accessibility of the market in Australia. So not too different from the UK. So maybe we should look at UK and Australia side by side on some of the impacts. We talked a little bit about scale device and how that's coming up. In the UK, I think we're seeing it more around self-service and execution only. I think we have to look to other countries, and I'm sure Phil will touch on some of this, to look at robo-advice and how that's really trying to create access. I think we're sort of hoping that we'll solve all our woes in the UK. At times it feels like that. But both in Australia and the UK, it's still in its infancy. Australia's beginning to take robo seriously. The regulator over there has set up a working party on robo-advice. They've also set up various initiatives around innovation to try and encourage more people to offer solutions in that space. But in reality, it's still very early days there, particularly if it's done on its own. Again, a similarity that we are seeing in both UK and Australia is less individual robo-advice solutions and more solutions that are part of an overall distribution channel. So normally in harmony with a call centre or face-to-face advice, offering some services in an automated way, but backed up very much by human dynamics as well. Whereas I think in some other territories we're going a little bit further. We're seeing a difference in the technology play. So in the United Kingdom, I think we still see very fragmented individual components. It's beginning to change, but we tend to see you will buy a portfolio management system from one supplier, a CRM system from another supplier, a cash flow planning system from another supplier, and a remuneration system from another supplier. In Australia, that tends to be an integrated one-stop shop. Not all the way, there are still some gaps. So, for example, platforms would tend to be a separate component, but there's much larger section of individual components that still exist over here in the United Kingdom compared to Australia. Even where they are coming from different suppliers, I think they're more integrated in Australia. So the platforms and the CRM solutions, for example, tend to be working together much closer in Australia. I think that comes back to that vertically integrated drive over there, so people are much tighter together. In the UK, there's still, if we're honest, some suspicion between the two camps. Both want to own the desktop, so therefore the integrations tend to be a little less tightly wound together, and they tend to be still passing over to the experience of one to the other with maybe some data flowing between, but maybe not as much as we would need. And certainly in Australia, it would be much tighter. You would expect some of the tools from the CRM providers to sit on the platforms directly themselves. So the integration is much, much more extreme. I think that in itself led to, in United Kingdom, us focusing on re-engineering within processes. So, we will hone our investment management proposition, we'll hone our cash flow proposition. Whereas I think in Australia, we've seen that go a bit wider. So we've seen it looking at processes and joining processes up from the start to finish. And so we're seeing people looking at how they can bring costs down by getting some sort of workflow solutions out there, document management solutions out, engaging the client into the actual advice process so that they can actually get things a bit more streamlined. To put that in context, to create a suitability letter in the UK, according to Investment Trends, is, I think it was 7 hours, 5 minutes to create a suitability letter from start to finish when you include fact-find research, etc. In Australia, the same process will take about 6 hours, 6 minutes, I think it was. So I think it's faster, and that's despite the regulations being a bit tougher over here and their equivalent of the suitability letter being a lot bigger. So they've actually managed to bring things down. They're looking at techniques like barcoding. So they work with paper rather than just always trying to replace it. So sometimes they are replacing paper. So in a fact find, there will be online fact finds. But equally, some of the firms over there were seeing, not trying to replace it with an online system, but putting a barcode on a paper system. So when the client writes it in on the paper-based system, it gets sent to the head office, it's scanned in, and the scanner recognises who it's from and files it in the CRM system against the right person. Will kick off the workflow, which could be a task to the advisor to call the client to say it could be a letter automatically generated to the client, say, we've received your fact find back, and advisor will be in contact within 48 hours, and then the reminder going to the advisor to call them in 48 hours. So there's various techniques like that they're looking at streamlining processes. So that's not just about bringing effort down, that's bringing elapsed time down by actually stopping the gaps as well. I think another structural thing that's quite different and quite noticeable, banks are the main distributor out in Australia, often through ownership. Talk about transparency, I don't think that ownership's always transparent, certainly to the end consumer. So you will have some companies that will have distributors in the bank's name, but will also own other firms that are in a different name. I was reading some research this morning, and there was one example where they surveyed the clients, and 55% thought this firm was independent, whereas actually it was owned by the bank. In the UK, I guess we saw the withdrawal of the banks post-RDR. They're poised to re-enter, so I don't think we should kid ourselves. How will they re-enter? I think, looking at Australia, I think they'll be doing a lot of this. I think you'll see them offering simplified advice processes, robo-advice processes. They'll be having much more integrated solutions. The banks that I'm talking about are talking about a really integrated client journey. They're talking about clients going in on the internet to do some research, pressing the call me button, getting a phone call back, starting some advice or conversations by phone, potentially completing by phone, but more and more often sending an advisor out to see them as their needs are identified and got more complex. Now, we are seeing that in the UK, but at a much earlier stage. And I think when the banks come in, that's really going to accelerate that whole drive. And now, the other thing that we would see linked very much to all of what we were saying there is the solutions in the UK still tend to be channel specific. So as I said, we are seeing people that are offering robo and face-to-face and call center advice, but they tend to be all different technology stacks, and the technology tends not to talk to each other, or if they do, they sync every 24 hours. Over in Australia, we tend to see that underpinned by a single technology. So whenever you call into the company, whatever mechanism you use to call to contact the financial firm, their records of you will be up to date, and you will get that up-to-date position. And the final point, lots of vertical integration here, to the point where I think it's probably giving elements of conflict. The Australian market seems to not be that against it, though, and the regulator, while recognising some of the risks, also recognises some of the benefits of having vertical integration in terms of not least having an organisation that's large enough to sue when things goes wrong. In the UK, while we're seeing consolidation, we're seeing product providers move into the market and are upping their advice presence. We're seeing Old Mutual buy Intrinsic, for example. It's still a lot of individual firms that have their own identity over in the UK and their own independence. When the regulator in Australia did a recent survey to see progress on FOFA, 60% of the firms they interviewed were actually vertically integrated because that was the size of the market. They couldn't get wider than that. So this is a real dynamic that I think we should be proud of, that we have that high level of independence in the UK. But as I say, the Australians aren't driving that. They're actually quite happy with where they are. So what can we learn from that? Well, I think there's a number of things. First of all, I think from both sides of the globe, we can see that actually regulation can improve an existing marketplace. For all the faults of RDR and FOFA, we have seen an increase in professionalism. We have seen an increase in transparency within the market and a removal of bias. And technology can help underpin that and help produce those services at a level that maybe we couldn't previously do. But the other thing that is really common in both markets is the regulation isn't really driving the demand. And it comes back to that accessibility and making sure that people understand that they need the services that we provide. And when we're looking at that accessibility, I think people generally are the same over the world. There are cultural differences, but people still need to be encouraged to invest. And we need to find ways to engage with the marketplace. And we need to use technology to help us facilitate that. Now, I think all too frequently we think of technology to engage as digital. And I think that is part of the solution. And I'm not sure that even in Australia or in the UK we've got that great. I think America does a lot better in terms of ways to engage. And if you go on to some of the websites out there, I think it's FlexScore that have a methodology to engage people, that they give you a financial survey, you fill it in and they rate you. And they give you a score that you're then comparing to your peers, and they'll say you've scored 60%, your peers of your age group in Stratford-upon-Avon are scoring 80%. These steps will help you improve. So it kind of appeals to that competitive instinct in all of us to try and improve our position. And it's a real nice engagement route. There's some very good gamification type ideas over in the States as well. I don't think we've really seen those in these markets. What we have seen more in Australia in engagement is a better use of CRM. So I think what we've tended to use the technology and systems for in the UK is we've tended to see the CRM systems here as contact management systems, a glorified address book and listing all the contacts that we have and the contact points that we have with them. We may take it as far as remuneration. I think in Australia they're much better at using that to mine their existing client banks and those clients that maybe have gone dormant to try and find those service needs. And so that's not about technology being in front of the client, it's about technology being used more effectively in the back office. So I've seen some really good case studies and spoken to some firms in Australia that are using the relationships they have within their existing client bank to do very good succession planning. They will sell to the grandfather, the father, and the son and daughter and work that very effectively through. So they know that maybe the daughter or the son aren't yet financially strong enough to take their full services, but they analyse their client bank in family groups and they make sure that they look after them for that reason because they know they will inherit the money as it comes down, and they look at the whole entities as well. I don't see that same entity management in the UK as I do in Australia. I don't really see working professional relationships via CRM systems as they do in Australia. The Australian systems will have dedicated portals for professional advisors. So we have the technology to do that over here, but Australia are exposing their core CRM systems, not all of it, but the key components, to professional advisors so they can log leads online, they can track leads online back with the financial advisor, they can share the key documents that they're allowed to share, data protection always being borne in mind, to let that flow through. So I see much more back office technology being used to engage the clients in Australia than we do in the UK, but less so at the front office. And this unified platform, I think, is also absolutely key. That is enabling the companies that are coming to market with multiple distribution channels in Australia to give that unified, consistent brand experience to their clients. And I think it's really important that we don't sort of disappoint the clients by letting them starting off one channel and then they're dialing in and having to start again. I mean, it annoys us all when we phone up Vodafone and you've got to get transferred to a different department. You have to go through all the security again and you have to give all your details again. Our clients are exactly the same. They want us to know them as individuals regardless how we contact them. So in conclusion, and before I go into the slide on conclusion, I was reading a survey only yesterday by Mercer's that actually rated the financial markets. It was a bit like a score. I also had my daughter's report yesterday, and it was I was sort of like comparing the two styles. My daughter did all right though; she was fine. But this report was on the different markets out there, and Australia came second in the market. Denmark was top. Australia got a B+. UK got a B. Now, they came up with the scores based on a complex algorithm which looked at different areas of the market. They came up with adequacy, which was about how much were the core benefits within the market. And Australia pipped us to the post on that a little bit. They came up with integrity, which was around the governance, about the regulation of the market. And again, Australia's slightly ahead of us. And then they came up with sustainability, and that was the bit that UK did really, really badly on. And that was around how much contributions you were putting in, people were putting, how much savings people were putting aside. And that's the bit that we're really, really falling down on according to Mercer. So I just thought that was interesting to contrast. So the conclusions that we would make, the two countries, we are different in many ways. The advice markets are running fairly similar now. I think UK's caught up. There were certain areas that certainly for many years were ahead in Australia. So the platforms, for example, were much more advanced for a long time in Australia. Last year, the inflows were a higher percentage in the UK for the first time than they were in Australia, but for many, many years they were ahead there. And I think we see that continuing through. Most of the platform technologies actually in the UK now are based on Australian systems, or New Zealand. FNZ, Bravura, GBST, they're all technologies that have come out of the Southern Hemisphere. The reason why Australia was ahead in the platform markets and many others was because of that amount of money that created those big pots that we talked about. Also linked very much to that is the highly complex tax regimes that sit around there that drove that. And I guess the bottom line to that is if we need to increase access, which is the common denominator across both, a big part of that is that access being driven through technology routes. I don't see that as individual robo-advice services that stand alone. I see that very much in harmony with other services. And if we can do that with a technology base underneath that is unified, then so much the better. So I think there are plenty of things that we can take from both sides of the globe. We want to keep the best. Kylie to James Bond from the UK. But there is plenty of things that we do want to leave behind. We don't want the over-regulation. We can go too far. And we certainly don't want the UK weather and maybe the English rugby success we can leave behind as well. So that's all I was going to take you through. Thank you very much for your time.